In his 2014 Charlottesville TEDx talk, How the Story Transforms the Teller, Donald Davis captivates the audience with a moving story about his father, Joe. In 1906, Joe was just a 5-year-old boy living on a small farm in North Carolina. He wanted to use his father's axe, and one night after his mother had called the family into the house for dinner, Joe lagged behind so he could sneak in a few moments alone with the tool. Even though he'd been warned not to touch it because he could get hurt, he really wanted to try to use it. When he was sure his dad and older brothers weren't looking, he picked it up and began chopping. Eventually, his mom realized he hadn't come inside, so she called out to him. In his rush to place the axe back into the log his dad had left it in, it bounced off the edge and struck his leg, slicing through his kneecap. This moment changed the trajectory of Joe's life in ways he couldn't even imagine. And the events that followed were shaped by a number of decisions beyond his control. The local doctor didn't have the knowledge or resources to deal with such an injury and suggested amputating Joe's leg. But Joe's father refused. Instead, he placed Joe on his horse, rode 16 miles to the nearest train station, asked what time the next train was coming and where it was going, and together they rode over 170 miles to Atlanta. To get Joe through the train ride, his father gave him some homemade corn whiskey to put him to sleep. He had no idea where they were going, only the radical possibility that he might find a doctor who could save his son's leg. And through a combination of luck, good timing, and determination, he did. Now, on the surface, this looks like a story about the power of positive thinking. Joe's father simply believed that despite a lack of evidence, his son's leg could be saved. But I'd argue that hope, genuine, life-giving optimism, the kind that fuels us in a crisis, is not the same as positive thinking. Now, I can't know for sure what Joe's father was thinking, but I don't imagine he was smiling and ignoring the gravity of the situation while holding his injured son in his arms as they rode that train to Atlanta. I imagine he felt a range of things: guilt, fear, rage, perhaps despair. And I'd guess that those very feelings fueled him, moving him to act as he did. His hope didn't come from ignoring his emotions, but from being in touch with the full depth and breadth of them. In our society, positive thinking is often treated as a purely rational exercise. Tell yourself everything will be okay. When something bad happens, make the best of it. Don't wallow. But what if, instead of avoiding or overriding what we feel, the very emotions that surface in hardship are exactly what we need to move through it? Back to Joe. The doctors in Atlanta were able to save his leg, but it would never function fully. At just 5 years old, Joe was now permanently disabled at a time when men earned their living through physical labor. Avoiding amputation was one thing, but Joe's challenges were just beginning. What would life look like for him as he grew? How would he recover from this debilitating setback? Welcome to Beyond the Box, where we ask how pushing past the boundaries of our beliefs gives us access to radical possibilities and makes us more resilient. I'm Tamara Kellam, an organizational development consultant passionate about transforming systems through collective resilience. Today, I want to talk about something I've been dealing with in my own life, and it's learning how to stop performing positivity and instead learning how to find purpose, possibility, and presence in my challenges. When problems arise, superficial platitudes can't sustain us, and we're all familiar with them. Everything happens for a reason. Time heals all wounds. You need to love yourself before you can love anyone else. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. If you're brave enough to say goodbye, life will reward you with a new hello. I'm not saying there isn't some truth in these statements, but they're overused and they tend to oversimplify life's complexity. When life knocks us around, we not only need a source of continual replenishment, we need something that grounds us, something that anchors us. Viktor Frankl, a psychotherapist, Nazi concentration camp survivor, and author of Man's Search for Meaning, argued that suffering itself is not what debilitates us. It's meaningless suffering that can tear us apart. Despair, he said, is suffering without meaning. But the word meaning itself is a little tricky semantically because it has multiple definitions. It can refer to the cause of something, why something happened, or it can refer to the result or consequence of an event, the purpose it might serve in the future. Frankl was interested in the latter. He encouraged people to not look backward to find meaning in why suffering happened, but to look forward and create meaning by giving suffering purpose, to synthesize pain into something new. Because the truth is, there often is no inherent purpose in suffering. People who believe their pain and hardship is divinely orchestrated may feel at peace with it. But for others who don't share that philosophy, it's important to make this distinction. The goal isn't to explain why it happened, because that tends to lead us down a rabbit hole of sense-making, which is very different from meaning-making. Sense-making seeks closure. It's about closing the loop. Sense-making often pulls us into rationalizations. One form is what psychologists call counterfactual thinking. These are those looping thoughts of what should or could have been, even though nothing can change the past. Another form shows up when we try to desensitize ourselves from disappointment with phrases like, well, I didn't really want that to happen anyway. We try to make ourselves feel less sad or disappointed about what happened. Sense-making can soothe us temporarily, but it narrows our perspective. It traps us in explanations instead of opening us to learning. This is very different from meaning-making, on the other hand, which isn't about looking backward. It looks forward. It doesn't ask why something happened, but asks, what might I create from this? Meaning-making lives in presence rather than the past, and it emerges through radical acceptance. It makes space for complexity, for both grief and gratitude, anger and hope. So while sense-making is about closure, meaning-making is about creation. And this is exactly what Donald says Joe's mother taught him when he returned home. She sat him down and told him to talk about the situation. And at first, Joe resisted. He didn't want to talk about it because he felt it was pointless. He said, well, it's not going to change what happened. But she looked at him and she said, you're not telling the story to change what happened. You're telling the story to change you. And I find this so important because it flies in the face of what so many of us are taught. We're taught to ignore certain parts of the situations, the parts that are painful or uncomfortable, or we're taught to rationalize other people's behavior or to tell a version of the story that sounds more empowered or more positive. But what if we didn't do that? What if we simply told the story as it is? No justifications, no explanations, no rationalizations. What if it just happened and you let yourself name it without needing it to fit a particular narrative? Because sometimes the power isn't in changing the story. It's in changing your relationship to it. So Joe's mother had him tell the story the way he experienced it without changing it. But then she had him tell it again from the perspective of the doctors who saved his leg and what they might have learned from that situation. And again, from his parents' perspective, from their point of view and what they might have learned. And again, from his brother's point of view, focusing on what he could now do that they couldn't since he was no longer forced to work on the farm. And she didn't use platitudes. She didn't dismiss his pain. She instead invited him to face the trauma head on and to expand his perspective until new meaning could take root. So you'll see that she invited him to see the situation from other people's points of view, not as a way of invalidating his experience, but instead as a way of expanding and broadening his own. This is important because our version of reality is not reality. So the more perspectives we can incorporate into our worldview, the more possibilities we give ourselves access to. And this is important because it really factors into the way that Joe was able to find and create meaning in the situation. Now, I want to circle back to radical acceptance and how Joe's ability to look at the situation head on from multiple perspectives was an example of radical acceptance in action. Radical acceptance doesn't mean being okay with what happened. It means simply acknowledging reality, that what's done cannot be undone. And it also means holding complexity. Joe could feel angry about his injury and grateful at the same time. And this is critical for resilience because true optimism makes space for that kind of complexity. Positive thinking, in contrast, often demands that we choose one or the other. Radical acceptance requires emotional intelligence, specifically self-awareness and the ability to tolerate the more uncomfortable and complex emotions. Without those skills, positive thinking becomes a mask, a way to avoid the harder feelings of disappointment, hopelessness, grief, fear, loss, and so on. So what did radical acceptance make possible for Joe? Because he could no longer work the farm, he was able to go to business school. Later on in life, he was able to buy a bank. By the time he was in his 50s, he was known by the local townspeople as Banker Joe. But some of the elders in town would refer to him as Cripple Joe, pointing back to his childhood injury. And Donald, when he heard this, was very offended, and he protested this nickname. When he told his dad, Joe, that he didn't like that, here's what Joe had to say about it. He looked at his son and he said, "If I hadn't gotten to be Cripple Joe, I would have never gotten to be Banker Joe." It is never truly tragic when something people think is bad happens to you, because if you can learn to use it right, it can buy you a ticket to a place you never would have gone any other way. Now, Joe had no way of knowing as a child where the injury would lead. The meaning only unfolded through his experience, through his life journey. But here's why many of us miss this. We're hardwired to make sense of things. We hate when things are left open-ended. We seek closure. So when life disappoints us, the temptation is to jump to an explanation, to seek a conclusion, to satisfy that need for closure. Psychologists call this the need for cognitive closure. Some of us have a stronger need for this than others. So for example, let's say you don't get a promotion. Instead of sitting with the disappointment, you might think, well, the manager didn't like me. And maybe that's true, and maybe it's not. But what if your fear of negative feedback is keeping you from seeing the other factors involved in that decision, factors that you could actually learn from? So sense making has neurological roots. It conserves our cognitive resources when things feel unresolved, right? So we can't spend too much time thinking about all the things that we need closure on. It can take up a lot of our cognitive resources. But it also has some downsides. It can reduce how much pain we feel in the short term, which sounds appealing, but it also reduces how much joy we feel too. So if you don't get hired or you don't get promoted, you may dull the pain by saying, that team wasn't a good fit for me anyway. But let's say you do get the promotion, you might write it off by saying, oh, well, there weren't that many applicants anyway. So over time, sense making, if overused, dulls our capacity for both sorrow and joy. So we become fragile, less able to tolerate feedback, and more cut off from the fullness of life and our own emotions. This is why positive thinking, tied to sense making and rationalization, can be so limiting. Hope and optimism, on the other hand, requires us to clear out our emotional filters, to notice how fear might be clouding reality, to look at a situation from as many perspectives as possible without rushing to make it mean anything just yet. Joe didn't know what his injury meant. He couldn't have. But the possibility of a different path, one that didn't tether him to a lifetime of farm labor, was all he needed. That possibility sustained him. Authentic hope and optimism kept him going even through a life-altering setback. And if his mother hadn't had the presence of mind and wisdom to help him sit with his pain, retell his story, and expand his perspective, he might never have unlocked that possibility. Who people knew as Crippled Joe at 5 might have remained Crippled Joe at 55, and we might have never heard the story of Banker Joe. Now, Lisa Leahy and Robert Keegan say in their book, How the Way We Talk Can Change the Way We Work. Some problems, if we can bear to stay in relation to them and not solve them too quickly, can teach us a great deal. We can use them to solve us. Here, solve doesn't mean fix. It means unlock, like solving a puzzle or putting a puzzle together, seeing the bigger picture. Problems, when faced, can open new possibilities in our lives, our teams, our organizations, even our communities. Ultimately, when we rush to neatly package, define, and label our experiences to move past them rather than through them, we often miss out on what they have to offer. Sometimes in trying to make sense of a problem, we overlook its hidden opportunities, its radical possibilities. Platitudes may comfort us for a moment, but presence, acceptance, and authentic hope transform us. So as we close, I'll leave you with this. What problems are you in a rush to solve? And how might you bear to stay in relation to them, letting them unlock something new within you? Until next time.